Hello, everyone. So happy to see so many of you joining us from across the Pacific. Welcome to the third webinar for the Young Pacific Leaders Small Grants Program. My name is Phoebe Hybeck, and I'm a Program Development Officer on the Program Development team here at Cultural Vistas. For those of you who have not worked with Cultural Vistas before, we are a nonprofit international exchange organization, and we are the implementing partner for the YPL Small Grants Program, which is funded by the U.S. Department of State, U.S. Embassy, New Zealand. So you'll notice that we do all of our timing in New Zealand Standard Time. This is because we are funded out of the U.S. Embassy in New Zealand. The Small Grants Program is an opportunity for alumni of the Young Pacific Leaders Conference, also known as the YPL Conference, to apply for small grant funding for a project they want to implement in the Pacific region. For those of you who may not know, there have been 6 YPL conferences since 2013, also known as Young Leaders of the Pacific. In order to apply to this YPL Small Grants Program, one of the core team members from your project or for your project must be a YPL alumni. To help alumni prepare for the Small Grants Program, Cultural Vistas is hosting webinars to provide additional information to help teams with their project proposal. The first webinar took place on Tuesday, March 26th, and was focused on developing and submitting a grant proposal. And the second took place last week on Tuesday, April 3rd, focusing on putting together a core project team. This third webinar is focused on budgeting. Yay! I know a lot of you have questions about budgeting, and this webinar is intended to help those interested teams better understand the budgeting process, review the budget template, and to help answer questions about what expenses can and cannot be included in your project budget. All of our webinars are recorded live at 9 a.m. Auckland, New Zealand local time. The next and final webinar will be next Tuesday, April 16th. Same time, same place. This last and final webinar will be a live Q&A to help answer any last-minute questions interested applicants may have before the application deadline on Thursday, April 18th at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand time. Webinar attendance is not required. However, it is strongly encouraged for you and your potential core team members to attend or watch the recordings, as there will be more information provided to assist with applications and to also help answer any questions you may have. It's also a great opportunity to understand the general requirements that may apply to other grant applications. So it's a good way to learn how to apply for a grant. For those of you who are watching live, thanks for tuning in. You can submit your questions in the chat box, and I will answer those at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions that pop up as we're going throughout, feel free to go ahead and chat them through, and I will get to those once we conclude with the content for the webinar today. If you cannot attend live and have questions to ask, you can email those questions to yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and your question will be answered and possibly discussed further during the next webinar. So we have a keen eye to our inbox the next couple of weeks because we know the deadline is approaching quickly. So feel free to shoot your questions into that inbox as well, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Again, I know as we returned from the YPL conference, the inbox was a little bit slow, but we do have an eye on it and are trying to get information back to you as quick as possible. So go ahead and send them to email as well. So this webinar recording will be uploaded to the YPL website before the end of the week. For those needing additional accessibility resources, including access to the PowerPoint presentations, please feel free to reach out via the email address yplgrants@culturalvistas.org, and we can help to provide those as well. change our slide. There we go. So just as a reminder, here is the timeline for the YPL Small Grants Program to help you think about preparing your application and the timeline for the implementation period. So you should be seeing on your screen a new slide with a timeline. Important dates that I'd like to note for you are 1, the application deadline, which is April 18th, 2019 at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand local time. The final webinar date, which is next Tuesday, April 16th at 9 a.m. New Zealand local time, and you log in the same way as you did today. And then lastly, the selection date. So we are projecting that our teams that are selected and the projects that are selected will be notified by late May 2019. Please also keep in mind the dates for the kickoff workshop, the implementation period, and the debriefing seminar, as those require your attention as well. Like I mentioned, today's webinar is focused on preparing your budget and how your budget factors into project management. Creating a budget can be overwhelming, but it is a critical piece when applying for grant funding. You have to demonstrate in the budget how your project is going to get done, specifically for YPL, and the timeline of 6 months. That's our project implementation period timeline. The budget further explains the project idea that you lay out in your narrative. That's why it's so important. To help, all budget information as well as the program application can be found on the YPL Small Grants website, which is culturalvistas.org/YPL. So I'm going to take us to our website and we'll kind of go through the different budget pieces on our website. So all applicants, when submitting a proposal for the Small Grants Program, must use the provided budget template in or for your project budget. This template can be found if you scroll down to this section right here. How do I come up with a budget? So you'll see that you can download this template here. This will open an Excel spreadsheet, which looks like this, as soon as you click on this button just here. You additionally can find the template if you click into the Apply Now section. The budget template is also found here, the downloadable template, so you'll see just here. If you have any issues downloading this template, please also send us an email and we'll get you that document via email as soon as possible. Now, all that being said, let's take a deeper look at the template itself. So like I said, this is the template that you need to submit with your project proposal when you submit the application through our online portal. And this budget template is actually very helpful because it's modeled after costs that are generally associated with grant funding. So if you're looking for other grants, this is a great model to use because it replicates other grant funding opportunities. At Cultural Vistas and on this program, we abide by the regulations and rules related to the United States Department of State grants, since this program is a U.S. government-funded program. These guidelines are also very similar, like I said, to other funder requirements. So it is important that you always check the budget requirements before submitting an application. So you provide the correct information and do not request funding for something that is not eligible for funding or cannot be covered. Going back to the items we discussed all the way back in webinar 1, it's very important to make sure that in your application you include all requested required items listed in the grant application. So if you see on the grant website or wherever you're finding your grant or the grant opportunity, make sure that you're including all of the requested and required items listed in that application. This also applies to the budget, making sure that you're including all of the information that's requested in the budget. We're going to go through this template and guidance provided regarding some of the things that funding cannot cover for the YPL Small Grants Program. First, when you're starting your budget form, be sure to fill out the top section of the template found here so that we know what project this budget is being associated with. On all of your grant proposal documents, it's really important to include and be consistent. Make sure that you have all of your information related to your project name, your project location. For the project location, please let us know where the project is being implemented. If it is going to take place in multiple countries, please do list those out. Your project title should match the project title that you include in your application. So make sure that that's also consistent across the board. On this template, you'll see in these two sections the total amount requested and the total cost share. These are two different things. The total amount requested is the amount you are asking for from the YPL Small Grant Program. These funds are the total of what you are outlining in the sections at the bottom of this template. This money has to specifically go to the project you are outlining in your project proposal. The total cost share is any funds that you may be receiving from other partners or funders. Some people have asked whether your project can have funding from other sources, and yes, it is encouraged that you find opportunities to further fund your project, but we do not need to know the specific details of those funds, just include the total amount of money you have received for your project from other funders. So that goes in the total cost share contribution from other partners right here. Demonstrating a cost share really highlights the sustainability of your project if it has funding outside of what you are requesting, but again, it's not required, just encouraged. As a reminder, for the 2019 YPL Small Grants Program, you can request up to $10,000 US. You may conduct your project in your local currency. However, you need to be sure that this amount is converted to no more than $10,000 US. This also needs to be consistent across all of your documents and budget. So as you go through and fill out your budget, please be sure that all of your items in your budget are in the same currency, your total including. So make sure everything on your budget form is in the same currency. It's important that you only request the amount that you need based on your project proposal and budget research. You can request up to $10,000 USD, but you do not need to ask for the full amount of money. If you only need $3,000 for your project, only apply for $3,000. You will need to demonstrate that the money you receive is being spent towards the project if selected. And if selected, it's important that you remain on target to spend the amount of funds you requested in your budget. So it is important to not ask for too much funding if you do not have a project that needs that much. Your proposal is going to be reviewed and only feasible projects will be selected. One way to make sure that you are not requesting more than needed for the project is to request and search for quoted prices on the budgeted items you are proposing. So do your research. As an example for this, if you are doing a workshop in one of the Pacific countries, receiving a transportation or quotes for flights confirms a range of the amounts you may need. These quoted items can be detailed in a budget narrative attached in the supporting documentation on the application if you're interested in providing this information and feel as though it makes your application stronger. So again, do your research on your quotes and make sure what you're proposing is in line and also something that you'll be able to spend funds on. So back to the overall template. After the top portion of the background and the instructions, you'll see that the budget is broken up into 4 section. So under this item description, you'll see 4 sections: supplies, travel, personnel, and other. This is to help guide your thinking as you break down your project's cost. As previously mentioned, these 4 sections mirror a similar budget structure to other U.S. Department of State grants. This document helps to provide a template and learning experience that you can build off of for potential future funding opportunities. Budgets are meant to describe or list out what you will be spending money on. In other words, each line needs to demonstrate the cost of what is going towards your project. You do not have to fill out every line on the template here, but do try to make your budget as detailed as possible. So going off of this template, here are some instructions to assist you with drafting your budget. First and foremost, be sure to enter an item description for every budget item that you are including. If it doesn't seem to fall within the first 3 categories, you definitely can put it in the item under the other category. You can also include your own categories that may fit for your project. These 4 categories are useful as they are general grant categories for various grants. Supplies. What new things do you need to make your project work? Do you need staplers? Do you need publishing? What supplies do you need? Go ahead and include them in that line. So it depends on kind of the breakdown of how you want to structure your budget. This is what we encourage. Travel. This is basically any logistical travel cost. Some examples may include a project that has team members in multiple countries and you need to come together to implement the project. So you need travel funds for that. A workshop where you are bringing people from different countries, or if your project is in a rural location, you may need to bring people from from that location to an urban area. So could cover transportation cost, etc. If the project is an exchange, cost to bring participants for your project from one country to another. So these are a few costs that could fit in that travel section. Personnel. This is a less common of an expense, generally only if you have to pay a professional to come in and implement a workshop, such as a trainer or facilitator. It could also be for professional services, such as items like multimedia materials, website development, those kinds of things. Most importantly, this is not intended for salaries. So again, not intended for salaries. Salaries are not allowed with this funding. So I'm going to pause for a second. It looks like we have some echoing. How is it now? Are you guys hearing me okay? So if you could go ahead and type in the chat box just to let me know you're hearing me okay, and I'll keep going. Awesome. Looks like we have clear sound. Thanks, guys. So we'll go ahead and keep going. So like I said, just on the salaries note, salaries are not allowed with this funding. This could be, however, for an honorarium or speaking fee. This kind of goes up into the professional services above. You can provide this for a professional assisting with your project, which is not considered a salary. However, the honorarium should not exceed $250 per speaker. In the other category, this is basically any costs that don't fall under the first 3 categories. Some examples may include hotel meeting space for a workshop, catering if you are hosting a meeting during lunch, audio visual requirements, that kind of thing. So once you decide which category the expense will go in, you'll need to include the item description of the expense. It's really important that you include that information. So that item description will go in this first column. And then you'll include the item cost in the second column. This can again either be in US dollars or in local currency. Just once you pick one, you have to reflect it throughout the entire document in all of your proposal documents. Be sure, again, to be uniform in this. I can't harp on this enough. All either in your local currency or in US dollars. It's your decision, but just make sure it all matches. You can also select at the bottom of this sheet what currency you're using. So you'll see here that all of the currencies are represented. Go ahead and select which one you'll be using. You'll then next enter the number of units for each item you are listing. An example of that would be, so under the supplies category, if you say that you needed paintbrushes for your project, you would list out how much those paintbrushes cost and then exactly how many of those paintbrushes you'll be buying. And then from there, the total will automatically calculate in this gray column here. So you'll see here, this is where the total will automatically calculate. It's important to remember that all items over $50 must be itemized and described. Do not just include lump sums of the cost without fully describing the anticipated expenses. This is where the information from the quotes you requested or required/researched comes in handy to help ensure accuracy in your estimates and that you're requesting the correct amount of funds. Finally, up here you'll notice that this last point states that budgets cannot exceed 10,000 US dollars. Successful funding requests will be at competitive rates and prove how costs directly relate to the project. So again, keep this in mind. Be sure to check that your final requested amount meets or is below 10,000 USD, and be sure to also factor in exchange rates. There is not a set exchange rate that we use. If you do decide to use your local currency as the currency in your budget, it's important to factor this in while developing your budget so that you do not exceed the amount allowable for the grant. So if you're planning on using another currency, make sure you double check the exchange rate. One piece of advice we can give you for exchange rates, Cultural Vistas recommends this converter site. We use this here in our organization. You can select which date you want it on here, as well as which currency you're trying to convert. And this is usually pretty accurate. We use this for our program resources as well. Another important thing to remember when choosing which section to input items in as you go through filling out your budget template. As a general practice, you should try not to move money between categories when you are implementing your project. So be sure to estimate as close to accurate the expenses you foresee, because it's not recommended that you move things in between the budget lines. So if you move things, say, from travel to supplies, those kinds of things. As the budget template notes, you can reallocate money if your project were to be selected, however, but never more than 20% of that category total. And again, this really is not encouraged, but if necessary, should generally be done with approval from the grant administrator. In this case, for the YPL Small Grants Program, that will be Cultural Vistas. For those of you new to budget management, it's easiest to try and avoid reallocating funds. However, it can be allowable in minimal amounts as a contingency for extenuating circumstances that may have occurred. As noted on the template, there are certain items that the YPL Small Grants Funds cannot be used for. So this is really important that you make sure you know what cannot be funded. First, international airfare to/from the United States, unless you have a team member from Hawaii or an American territory and you are conducting an exchange program between another Pacific country, or that team member needs to travel for any reason. Staff salaries, overhead, office, rent, things like that. If you need a meeting space, funds can go towards a shared workspace, but cannot be used to justify a long-term lease. Web server or internet provider for the project period can be funded, but this needs to be indicated under supplies. Large items of durable equipment. A reasonable request for equipment may be made on a case-by-case basis, but as noted in the last webinar, it cannot be for personal profit. An example is a printer. If you can explain why it is needed for the project, what you are printing as it pertains to the work you are completing, and that's justifiable, then this would be something that is fundable. So we encourage you to reach out to Cultural Vistas to see if something of larger, or if it is a larger item, to see if that is fundable. Excessive representation meals or entertainment is not fundable. For example, something that would not be fundable is if you requested funds to host a gala dinner. On this as well, as a note across all U.S. government programs, grant programs specifically as well, funds cannot be used for alcohol. Academic research is also not fundable with this specific grant. That is because this is not an academic grant. This is a project-focused grant looking for specific deliverables and outcomes, and therefore needs to show specific deliverables and outcomes from the project itself, not just research. And last but not least, partisan political activity. Funding cannot be used or applied to any government agencies or political activities. So you'll find in this little section what is not fundable, so I encourage you to look at that. If you're not sure about whether you can put a specific expense to the grant, please again email us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org and we can help clarify that for you directly. A question you all may be thinking about as we go through regarding your project's budget is how you are going to manage and track and then also report on the money being spent by your project team if selected. So we will show you and give you the answers to those questions. As noted early on in webinar number 2, the funding for the YPL Small Grants Program will be dispersed in 3 separate allotments, and projects teams will be required to provide a report every month throughout the implementation period detailing their expenses along with an update on how project implementation is going. Just to remind you, if selected, the project treasurer will receive 60% of the funds for the project after the kickoff workshop. The project will then receive 35% of the funds after submitting the required monthly reports in the midterm report. Finally, the project will receive the last 5% of the project funds after submitting the final report with the project results. It's important to think about your project management and that you are matching your expenses to the timeline you propose and the funding disbursement timeline. For example, if you know the majority of your project spending will occur up front, you will need to think about how you will offset the cost of those items that you cannot cover as you've just received 60% of the funds up front through the program. It's important to communicate this and any questions you have about this to Cultural Vistas, as there may be some flexibility and we can help navigate that situation for you. At the kickoff workshop, we'll again work with each selected project team closely to make sure that everyone understands the reporting requirements and how to track the expenses for the program, as well as what is possible during the budget management period. Following the kickoff workshop, each team will receive the 60% of the funding that they requested. Selected teams will only be eligible to receive the funding that was approved in their initial proposal they submitted. This money will be sent as a bank transfer to the project treasurer. Cultural Vistas will be covering the cost of the grant allotment bank transfer fees. If you have a project that will require you to move money between bank accounts, though, you may want to consider adding a line into your budget template under the other section for those bank fees. So this is just if you're planning on moving money from account to account. That's something you need to consider. If it's just transfer fees, Cultural Vistas will cover that. Each month in the monthly report, project teams will need to submit a budget report along with their project report narrative. The budget report will demonstrate expenses for that month and the remaining balance for each line item, along with copies of all receipts of purchase. The project report will be a narrative report that describes how the project implementation is going and any objectives that are being achieved. These monthly reports will be due the last day of the month. The September report will be a midterm report and will ask for some additional information as well as an analysis of how the project implementation is going so far at the halfway point. After the midterm report is received, the project team will receive the next 35% allotment of their funding. Teams will then have 2 more months of regular reporting. In December, the final report for the project will need to be submitted. And once the final report is received, the team will then receive the final 5% of funding allocated. As mentioned, teams will be required to provide receipts as a part of the budget management process and reporting on expenses at each report. So tracking throughout is really, really important, and so is organization, keeping all of those receipts as you go along and make purchases for your project. This tiered disbursement process and allotment ensures that Cultural Vistas is able to help monitor each team and also make sure that the selected projects are meeting their work plan that was outlined and agreed upon. Following the final project report, the debriefing seminar will be held in January 2020. At this seminar, project leaders will discuss their successes, challenges, learnings, and full project outcomes. As mentioned in previous webinars, programming and expenses, including visa fees needed to travel to New Zealand for the kickoff and debriefing workshops, will be covered by Cultural Vistas. We'll give more information to those teams selected at the time of selection. As we conclude the content piece of today's webinar, I just want to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. We will be working closely and with all selected participants during the kickoff workshop and during the implementation period to ensure your budget meets and addresses the project's needs. Your proposal should be focused on telling your project story through the items that you need to make it happen. Do demonstrate how you plan to achieve the project you describe in your narrative description through your budget. So why do you need these supplies? Be descriptive, make sure you're accurate. And overall, during the review of applications, we will be looking at whether project budgets align with the proposal and the overall project's impact. It's important to keep in mind while constructing your budget that the 3 things we look for in a project application are feasibility, sustainability, and scalability. Feasibility, what does that mean? It means, can you complete the project in the given time period? Sustainability, that means how can you continue your project and impact the targeted community past the funding timeframe? Can your project keep going after the implementation period? And then lastly, scalability. How can the project continue to grow in size or in impact? Now to the questions. I'm sure you all have quite a few of them. Before we get to those in the chat box, here are some common funding questions we have received from other small grant programs and potential applicants. So our first question is, what do I need to consider when making purchases for the grant? Project teams need to do their due diligence, meaning that they are able to demonstrate that the expenses are cost effective, such as not just picking your favorite airline if you have to purchase a flight. Make sure that you do compare cost and go with a reasonable or average priced expense. So it goes down to research. Make sure you do your research. Another question, can I request funding for an already established project, or would it be allowed for our proposed project to use YPL funds to supplement an upcoming project we are planning to implement during the YPL grant period. Cost sharing is totally allowed and highlights the sustainability of the project. If you are proposing a collaboration with an existing project, this project would need to still fulfill the requirements listed under the YPL Small Grants Program guidelines and would also need to be within one of the 4 pillars of YPL. In your project proposal application, you would need to outline the work already completed on this project and emphasize how the YPL Small Grant 6 months of funding will further the work you're doing. Your application and budget must demonstrate and showcase the specific funds that will be applied for the 6 months of the YPL program. For example, a previous small grants program recipient that we had for another regional program was a team that was already regularly putting on hackathons in their countries and various countries associated with their project. However, they applied for grant funding specifically to host one very specific hackathon building on what they were already doing in a single country, and this demonstrated through their budget, they also, demonstrated through their budget how that hackathon was a part of the small grants program and what impact would be made through that additional funding. So making sure that you're outlining that information. Another question we've received is, do we need to include other sources of funds if we get an outside project sponsor? Yes, please do include that amount in the sum of funds in the total cost share piece of the budget template. Can the funds for program be used to implement stages of the plan after 6 months? So can the funds be used after the 6-month implementation period? The funds that you request should really set out to implement the project within the 6-month implementation period. As the implementation occurs, selected teams should work to ensure that these funds are used and spent within the funding period. So you need to make sure that your proposed budget and timeline are within and doable within the 6-month implementation period. Some more questions. Do I need to provide documents with my budget proposal? No, but if you are trying to demonstrate the need for large equipment, you do need to provide a quote. Again, we recommend that if you are planning to include large equipment purchases in your budget, you reach out to Cultural Vistas for confirmation that that item can be funded. No other quotes or invoices are required for the proposal unless you feel that they support your proposal, your application, and make it stronger. Can I include subscriptions such as a website host domain? Yes, that is a direct cost associated with your project. Be sure when documenting this in your budget, list monthly or bi-monthly cost as the unit. This can be charged up to the length of the grant, so up to 6 months. We've had a lot of questions on salary and administrative fees. So this one is specifically, can administrative fees be covered? Administrative fees would be considered under salary, office space, overhead expenses within that category, and therefore are not fundable. In terms of personnel, an honorarium or speaking fee for a professional assisting with your project, which is not considered a salary, is fundable. The honorarium, though, however, should not exceed $250 per speaker. If you are considering this more for the items you'll need to implement the project, such as pens, papers, etc., those are fundable, but those should be listed under the supply section of the budget and will need justification. Any specific cost as you go along filling out your budget or as we talk through today that you're unsure about, do feel free to email us and we can confirm whether they will be fundable. So one question on honorarium that we had is, can we provide an honorarium for team members? So just specifically for team members. And the answer to that question is no. That would be considered a salary and is not fundable. Not allowable, not fundable. However, you can provide honorarium to outside speakers or professionals, like I mentioned above or previously. However, you can cover for your team members hotel lodging and per diem, such as costs for food, etc., for team members to implement a training or workshop. So if you're hosting a workshop or training and you won't be providing meals for your team, you can provide per diem for them to do so. Is there a set exchange rate in US dollars we should use when estimating our expenses? Like I mentioned earlier, there is not a set exchange rate. If you do decide to use your local currency as the currency in your budget, it's important to factor this in while developing your budget so you do not exceed the amount allowable for the grant. So if converted, you need to make sure that your local currency is within the funding restrictions. So $10,000 USD or less. Rather than using the project's treasurer personal bank account, would it be okay for us to open a bank account specifically for the project? So we received that question, and yes, it is acceptable to create a bank account specifically for the project if that's your preference. More questions we've received. Are purchases, for example, seedlings, preferable from Pacific Islands or okay from the US mainland? Throughout this program, we encourage all participants to use as many local goods as possible on their project with price justification and on a case-by-case basis. Some exceptions for use of goods outside the Pacific can be made, so it kind of just depends. Should we include in-kind donations? In-kind meaning in terms of utilizing our personal resources such as supplies, ink for printer paper, etc., that we already have that we may not plan to charge to the budget in this budget proposal for the application. You do not need to list out each item specifically for in-kind donated items. If this is a part of your cost share with partners that you may have, you can include that in the total amount at the top portion of the template. So remember to include that in the cost share section, the total cost share amount at the top portion of the template. We have a question about stipends. So what about stipends for participants for our workshops? Yes, you can include stipends or per diem for participants to attend a workshop. This is normally, again, similar to the team members for participants to have their meals if they're not included in the programming. You can categorize this under the travel section or other. And generally how we calculate per diem is by day using a researched estimated amount of the cost of meals in the country or city where the travel is taking place or the workshop is taking place. It's really important that once you calculate, you have a set rate for all. It's also important to include in your budget template the breakdown of amount per person in your budget. The last budget question that we have from our inbox is, can we have a contingency budget included? It is actually not recommended to have a general lump sum contingency budget. We recommend to slightly round up in your estimates in order to have a small buffer in your budget. An example with this is with flights. If you know that when you get around to booking your flights in your timeline and that you know closer to your workshop or proposed event, if it's a travel event, that the flights may be higher in fare, it's good to slightly buffer that in, but you should do your research and make sure that that buffer is just not extensive. It needs to be reasonable. Since a contingency budget is not recommended, this is why Cultural Vista stays in constant contact with the selected teams throughout the implementation period. And that's in order to help you course correct if you do find yourself concerned or needing some assistance with your budget management during the implementation period. So again, needs to make sure that your budget, you need to make sure that in your budget, what you're proposing is reasonable. With the flights example, it may fluctuate just slightly. It's not going to fluctuate very, very drastically, so making sure that you do your research and understand what is reasonable. Throughout the project, it's really important to remember that you need to be able to demonstrate that you are spending the money on the requested items throughout the project. So you're going to have to provide receipts. You'll also need to make sure that you're set to spend the money that you've asked for. So it's really important that everything that you propose in your budget template is researched and calculated and estimated pretty closely. So that is all of our questions that we've had regarding budget. And it looks like we've had a few come through. Let's see. Our question came through from Laura. What about travel within the same city? Yes, that is fundable as long as if you're hosting a workshop, you just need to estimate that out. A lot of transportation companies can give you quotes, so be sure to list that under the travel section. One thing that our participants from last year noted that they forgot to consider was the need to rent a van for specific activities or even fuel. So the cost of gas if they were using their personal car. So think about those different things. We also had a question from Manwia. Hi, Manwia. How do you calculate per diem? So generally how we calculate this is by day. Many countries have set rates. So we used a researched estimate of the cost of meals in that country or city, and we make sure that that rate applies to all that are being covered in our budget. And so what we do is we break that out. Once we calculate the rate per day per person, we break that out in our budget and make sure that it indicates this is the rate per day per person. Another question we had is from Melissa, and the question is, some transport like our local buses do not provide receipts. Do we put the fees only? So what you can do is you can actually create a receipt template and have the bus drivers sign off each time you take the bus. We've had to do this in previous small grants programs. So if you do have a question about that, feel free. If your project were to be selected, we can help provide those templates as well. So it looks like that's all of the questions we have so far in our chat box. Feel free to keep populating your questions in there if you have any more. For the time being, one of the questions that I wanted to address are those questions coming from our U.S. territories and Hawaii. I finally have your guidance and answers too. First, thank you so much for your patience. And second, I'll just jump right in and answer basically all the questions we've received thus far regarding U.S. territories and Hawaii's participation and the different restrictions associated with that. So our first question is there a threshold applicants have to demonstrate budgetarily or etc. to be able to receive funding regarding the requirement of travel or including a neighboring non-US country in order to be eligible? There is not a specific percentage threshold that you have to demonstrate related to budget, but the proposed project needs to demonstrate that it is substantially focused on including an outside non-US Pacific country. So again, these questions are just from our applicants applying from our US territories and Hawaii. Our second question is, can projects from applicants living in Hawaii or a US Pacific territory focus on Native communities from Hawaii or US territories living in those locations? Unfortunately, this government program, the answer is no. Applicants can propose a project related to Native communities, but it has to involve another foreign Pacific community or country. Excuse me. It has to involve, I'm going to correct myself, it has to involve another foreign Pacific country. Either the project will take place in another country or have some sort of exchange component. Our third question that we have is, can projects from applicants living in Hawaii or a U.S. Pacific territory focus on non-U.S. affiliated Pacific populations? For an example, the team is working in Hawaii, but a population of Micronesians are located both in Hawaii and the U.S. mainland. Unfortunately, the answer to this is also no. You have to demonstrate some sort of program exchange component. The fourth question is travel between a U.S. Pacific territory and Hawaii allowed with program funds? Yes, this could be fundable if it facilitates a program goal that extends outside of the U.S. territory and or Hawaii. The fifth question, does cross-country team apply to a team that has members from Hawaii and a U.S. Pacific territory? So the answer is yes, as long as the project meets the criteria outlined and still has an exchange component outside of Hawaii and the U.S. territory. Teams may have a cross-country team with Hawaii and the U.S. territories, but there still must be a substantial program element involving a non-U.S. state or territory. Another question is, can grant deliverables or expected outcomes be shared between both U.S. Pacific territories and Hawaii? Meaning, can the project have outcomes that were within the territory and Hawaii? As long as there is a Pacific country component that's non-U.S. and the project demonstrates substantial deliverables in that Pacific country, there can also be shared outcomes within the U.S. territory or Hawaii. Number 7, our last question that we have is, can all core team members be from American Pacific territories? Yes, but again, the project must occur outside the U.S. territories or bring communities from outside of the U.S. territory to the territory for the purpose of exchange. For example, an exchange between Fiji and Hawaii, where Fijians go to Hawaii, or an exchange between Fiji and Guam, where Fijians, go to Guam. So that kind of gives a breakdown. And again, the last few questions that I mentioned after we concluded our budget questions are those that we've received from the applicants interested in applying from a U.S. territory or Hawaii. So that brings me to the end of our questions. Do we have any more questions from today? It looks like we do. This question is from Melissa. If we are moving around the same province and there are invitations to carry on the same project beyond, should we carry on if we still have enough in our budget? Read that one more time. So with your project, if you do find funding elsewhere after the 6 month of the implementation period or during, you are more than welcome to continue pursuing that funding. You'll still have the YPL small grant funding through your final allotment, which will come after you submit the final report. And we do encourage you to seek funding elsewhere. These are just pieces that can be and should be communicated to Cultural Vistas. So it would be something that if a selected project team did receive funding during the implementation period from another organization to help supplement other costs in their project or to continue on the project, we would ask you to just outline that in your either monthly report or midterm and final report. So to answer Nadine's question, please clarify the exchange component. So basically, the answer is that for all of those projects taking place within the U.S. affiliated Pacific territories and Hawaii, there has to be some sort of exchange component demonstrating substantial deliverables and outcomes from that exchange with another Pacific country. So for instance, you can use Guam and New Zealand, or American Samoa and Fiji or American Samoa and Tuvalu or Vanuatu. So there just has to be some sort of outside of the US component exchange with another Pacific territory. Does that make sense? No problem. So it looks like that is all of our questions for today. If at any point, oh, just kidding, one more question from Nadine. The funds need to be spent outside of the U.S. affiliated, Pacific Territory, correct? So there can be funds spent within the U.S. affiliated, I keep making that mistake, Pacific Territory, but your project needs to substantially be focused on a country outside of the territory in the Pacific. So, for instance, if you have to purchase a flight from Guam to Fiji, then that is okay because if this flight is for your exchange component of the program, if that makes sense. So since we're just at time, or Fiji to Guam. No worries, Nadine. Yeah, so since you have more specific questions on this, why don't you go ahead and send me an email with those specific questions, and I'll get back to you on the restrictions, even more restrictions, even further on that. And then with that, no problem. For everyone else on the line as well, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. The recorded webinar will be uploaded by the end of the week and can be found on the Cultural Vistas website. For those of you who've had trouble finding the website or the webinars, if you take a look at our main page, you'll see they're just under the webinar section. You'll notice that in the corner, there is this 3-line option with an arrow. If you click on that, that will actually take you to the playlist where all of the webinars are housed. So you'll be able to find webinars 1 through 2 at the moment, and then webinar 3 as well by the end of the week. Both of them are posted, and the other one will be posted this week. Before we end, please don't forget that the next and final webinar will be on next Tuesday, April 16th at 9:00 a.m. New Zealand local time. So again, that's the same time as right now because New Zealand just experienced daylight savings time. And that final webinar will be focused on answering any last-minute questions that interested applicants may have. Please also don't forget that the application deadline to apply for the funding for the 2019 YPL Small Grants Program is Thursday, April 18th. So that's next week, Thursday, April 18th at 11:59 p.m. New Zealand time. Feel free to reach out to us at yplgrants@culturalvistas.org with any questions you may have between now and the next webinar. And thank you all so much for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again at the webinar next week. Have a great week. Thanks so much, everyone.